Nobody warned the Vorkai Empire about Glasgow on a Friday night. They had studied Earth for 11 months. They had mapped every military installation, every naval base, every air defense grid. They had calculated optimal invasion windows, psychological pressure points, and the precise moment when human resistance would be at its lowest. They chose a pub, not a military outpost. Not a government building, a pub in Glasgow at 10:30 on a Friday during a football match. The Vorkai called it a perfectly timed strike against an undefended civilian population center. The Scots called it Tuesday. If you've ever wanted to watch a spacefaring empire question every life decision it ever made, smash that like button, subscribe, and help us in reaching our first 1,000 subscribers. And drop a comment telling me what you'd order at the bar before the aliens showed up. Now let's step into the most gloriously chaotic night in human history, because nobody, not a single soul in the galaxy, was ready for what happened next. The Vorkai Dominion had conquered 43 worlds before they found Earth, 43. Each one different, some cold, some humid, some covered in oceans of liquid methane, but all of them had one thing in common. When the Vorkai ships appeared in the sky, the inhabitants looked up, calculated the odds, and surrendered within 72 hours. It was a good system. Clean, efficient. Predictable, Supreme Commander Draxus of the 7th Expansion Fleet was a firm believer in predictability. He was tall, slate gray, with 4 arms, and the kind of unblinking yellow eyes that made subordinates deeply uncomfortable during performance reviews. He had spent 300 years climbing through Vorkai military ranks by being methodical, disciplined, and absolutely ruthless about pre-invasion research. He had 12 analysts assigned specifically to Earth. They had done an extraordinary job. They knew about the nuclear arsenals. They had mapped the satellite networks. They understood the chain of military command from the president down to individual base commanders. They had cataloged every aircraft carrier, every missile silo, every submarine currently at sea. What they had not cataloged, what none of the 12 analysts had thought to include in their 15,000-page briefing document, was the specific cultural psychology of a man called Rab McAllister when someone spills his pint. Rab McAllister was 53 years old. He was 5 feet 9 inches tall, built like a wardrobe that had been in a fight with another wardrobe and won. And he had been coming to the Anchor Pub on Gallowgate Street in Glasgow every Friday night for 31 years. He had a regular stool. He had a regular order, tenant's lager, no glass, just the can, because he didn't trust the pipes since 2019. He had a regular opinion about the football, which was unprintable in most languages, including his own. He was not a soldier. He was not a veteran. He was a retired electrician who once rewired an entire tenement building while nursing a broken thumb and a grudge against the previous contractor. He was, by any measurable standard, a completely ordinary man. The Vorkai would have disagreed. Eventually, the first ships appeared at 22:47 local time. They dropped through the cloud cover like gray mountains falling sideways. Massive, angular, bristling with weapons arrays that glowed a deep arterial red. Emergency broadcasts cut into every television signal across Scotland simultaneously. An automated message in perfect English, delivered in a calm, synthesized voice, told the population of Earth that resistance was futile, that the Vorkai Dominion offered terms of peaceful surrender, and that all humans should remain calm and await further instruction. In Edinburgh, people ran. In London, the emergency response protocols activated within minutes. In Glasgow, the Anchor Pub went quiet for approximately 4 seconds. Then Rab McAllister looked up from his can, looked at the massive alien warship hovering over the Clyde, looked back at his can and said, "Aye, but did they have to park it right in front of the screen?" The football was still on. The match wasn't over. Davy Connor, 28, sitting 3 stools down, nodded seriously. "That's well out of order. Big Tam, Thomas Brennan, officially, though nobody had called him that since primary school, leaned forward from the far end of the bar. He was the size of a commercial refrigerator and had the philosophical outlook of a man who had survived 30 years of Scottish weather and still showed up on time. Right. Somebody needs to have a word with them. Nobody moved. The barman, a wiry Glaswegian named Stuart who had seen enough Friday nights to have lost the capacity for surprise, calmly pulled another can from the fridge, set it on the bar, and turned the volume up on the television. The alien broadcast continued overhead. Floodlights swept across the city. Military drones, sleek, six-winged things that hummed like angry hornets, began descending through the streets. One drone floated through the open pub door. It hovered in the middle of the anchor, scanning the room with a pulsing amber light. Its translator module activated. A clean, precise voice emerged from its speaker. Human occupants. This establishment is now under Vokai jurisdiction. Remain seated. Do not resist. Comply and you will not be harmed. The entire pub looked at the drone. The drone looked at the entire pub. Rab McAllister slowly turned on his stool. "Son," he said, with the patient tone of a man explaining something to a child who should already know better. "I've got half a can left and 11 minutes of football. You can have a seat or you can get tea." The drone processed this. Its translation matrix flagged several phrases as culturally ambiguous. It decided to wait. That decision would later be studied at the Vokai War College as one of the most consequential tactical pauses in Imperial history, because while the drone waited, Stuart behind the bar quietly reached under the counter, picked up the cordless phone, and called his brother-in-law Kenny. Kenny worked at the Cambuslang depot. Kenny drove a forklift. Kenny had a lot of friends by 23:15. The situation in Glasgow had already stopped resembling anything in the Vokai invasion manual. The drones were filing updated reports back to the fleet, and Supreme Commander Draxus was reading them with the expression of a man who had ordered chicken and been brought something that was still moving. He pulled up the first anomaly flag, civilian. Population in Sector 7, Glasgow urban zone, has not evacuated. Current behavioral analysis suggests population is aware of invasion. Reason for non-evacuation, unclear. He pulled up the second. Drone Unit GX7 reports verbal engagement with local human. Human appeared calm. Human used unknown idiomatic phrase. Human resumed consuming fermented beverage. He pulled up the third. Multiple civilian humans observed moving toward drone positions rather than away, carrying unknown objects. Threat assessment, pending. Draxus stared at the third report for a long time. "What are they carrying?" he asked. His analyst checked the visual data. "It appears to be bar furniture, Commander." Draxus said nothing. The analyst continued carefully. "And in one case, a traffic cone." Outside, on Gallowgate Street, Big Tam was walking toward the nearest Vokai ground unit with a bar stool under one arm and the calm, purposeful energy of a man who had somewhere to be. Behind him, 11 other men followed. None of them were armed. None of them were in uniform. Several of them were still holding drinks. The Vokai ground commander raised his weapon. Big Tam didn't stop walking. He just looked at the weapon, then at the commander, then said, "That better no be pointed at me, pal." It was. For about another 3 seconds. Then something happened that no Vokai soldier had ever experienced in 43 planetary conquests, and whatever came next would change every assumption the Empire had ever made about the species called humans. Because Big Tam kept walking, and the ground commander, for reasons he would never be fully able to explain in his after-action report, took one step back, just one step, but that was enough. Supreme Commander Draxus had a rule. He had many rules. 300 years of military command produced a lot of rules, but this one was the most important. Never deploy heavy assets until the psychological phase was complete. Break the populations will first. Let the ships, the lights, the broadcasts, and the drones do the work. By the time boots hit the ground in force, the enemy should already be defeated in their own minds. It had worked on 43 worlds. Glasgow was making him reconsider the sample size. By 23:30, the drone network over the city had filed 47 anomaly reports. Draxus was reading them in order, which was a mistake, because the progression from concerning to baffling to genuinely alarming happened faster than he'd anticipated. Report 12. Civilian male on Duke Street observed removing Vokai warning pylon from pavement and using it to direct traffic around a blocked junction. Pylon not recovered. Report 19. Drone GX-12 has been decorated with a football scarf. Drone continues to function. Scarf removal attempted twice. Scarf replaced both times by different humans. Report 23. 3 civilian humans observed attempting to order food from a Volkai supply drone. Drone does not serve food. Humans appear dissatisfied with this answer. Report 31. Volkai ground unit in Merchant City District reports humans are not fleeing. Humans are standing in doorways watching. Several are offering commentary. Nature of commentary, negative. Report 38. Civilian female threw a shoe at Scout Unit Alpha 9. Scout Unit Alpha 9 retreated. Civilian female retrieved shoe and went back inside. Draxus set the reports down. He looked at his second in command, a razor-thin officer named Vex who had survived 11 campaigns and still managed to look perpetually unsurprised. Vex, Draxus said. Why aren't they afraid? Vex considered this. Our intelligence suggests this city has a historical relationship with adversity, Commander. Poverty, industrial collapse, multiple conflicts across centuries. The population may have developed a higher-than-standard threshold for threat response. They threw a shoe at a scout unit. Yes. Commander, and the scout unit retreated. The scout unit filed a report describing the projectile as aggressive and unpredictable, Commander. It was a stiletto heel. Draxus breathed through his nose slowly. Deploy ground teams to the pub district. Establish control. Make it clear that we are the dominant force. No casualties. Just presence. Understood. The ground teams deployed. There were 40 of them, full combat armor, energy shields, pulse rifles, the works. They moved in 4-unit formation down Argyle Street with the disciplined precision of soldiers who had done this on a dozen different planets. They reached the first cluster of pubs at 23:44. What they found was not panic. What they found was Rab McAllister standing outside the anchor with 7 other men, all of whom had apparently decided that if aliens were going to take over the street, they were going to do it knowing exactly what everyone thought about it. The ground team leader. A senior officer named Kale activated his translator and announced, "Humans. Clear this area immediately. This is not a request." Rab looked at him. "It's a public pavement, pal. This area is under Volkai jurisdiction." Ye said that. "We're still here." Kale had a protocol for this. It involved escalating warning signals, first audio, then light, then a low-yield pressure burst that was uncomfortable but non-lethal. It was designed to move crowds without injury. It had never failed. He activated the audio warning. A high-pitched tone swept the street. Every man outside the anchor winced. Then Davy Connor, 28, pulled 2 pieces of foam from his jacket pocket and put them in his ears. He had brought earplugs. He had specifically anticipated that the aliens might be loud. He gave a thumbs up. Kale stared at him. Rab had not moved. "Look," Rab said with the tone of someone trying to be reasonable. "I don't know what ye want, but ye have parked your big daft ships over the Clyde. Ye have been shining lights in folks' windows for the past hour. And now ye're making a noise like a kettle with ambitions. What exactly is it ye're after?" Kale paused. The translator relayed the question accurately. It was technically a reasonable question. "We are here to establish dominion over your planet," Kale said. "What for?" Another pause, longer this time. "Resources, strategic position." "Expansion of the Empire." Rab nodded slowly, the way a man nods when he's being told something he's already decided is nonsense. "Right. And how's that been going for ye so far tonight?" Kale did not answer, because at that exact moment, his radio crackled with an urgent transmission from the eastern flank. 3 members of his ground team had become separated from the unit near the Barras Market. One had been given a cup of tea by an elderly woman who refused to accept that it was not wanted. Another had somehow ended up inside a chip shop. The third was involved in a situation that the reporting officer described as unclear, sir. But he appears to be losing an argument about football. Kale had 40 soldiers. He suddenly felt like he needed more. Meanwhile, inside the anchor, something far more important was happening. Stuart the barman had his phone out, and he was talking to his brother-in-law Kenny in fast, precise terms. Kenny had already called 3 people. Those 3 had called others. In the Cambuslang depot, where Kenny worked, 9 men with access to heavy equipment were listening carefully. On the south side, A former civil engineer named George was pulling a laminated map out of a kitchen drawer. In Partick, a retired structural surveyor was looking at photographs of the alien ships that someone had already uploaded and saying quietly to himself, those landing struts are load-bearing. Obviously, the Volkai had spent 11 months studying Earth's military infrastructure. They had not studied Kenny. They had not studied George. They had not studied the retired structural surveyor in Partick, whose name was Bill Henderson and who was already on his third cup of tea and his second piece of paper covered in calculations. And they absolutely had not studied what happened when you gave a Glasgow pub 30 minutes warning and a reason to be annoyed, because somewhere in the dark streets east of the city center, something was being built. Something improvised, impractical, held together with cable ties and collective outrage. Something that no invasion manual in 43 campaigns had ever had to account for. And Cale's radio was about to tell him exactly what it was, and he was not going to like the answer. The Volkai had a word for what was happening in Glasgow. They didn't have it when they arrived. They developed it over the course of approximately 90 minutes. And it translated roughly as the specific chaos that happens when you underestimate something that doesn't know it should be scared. It wasn't in any of their dictionaries yet. Vex had written it down in the margin of his tactical notepad because he had a feeling it was going to come up again. The eastern flank had fully dissolved by midnight, not militarily. The Volkai soldiers were still standing. They still had their weapons, their shields, their armor. Nobody had been hurt. But dissolved was the only word for what had happened to their operational coherence. Because the 40 ground troops that Draxus had sent into the pub district were now scattered across 6 city blocks in varying states of confused stillness. And the situation reports coming back to the command ship were the strangest documents in Volkai military history. Unit 7 had established a perimeter around a junction on Salt Market Street. They were maintaining it. Nobody was trying to get through. However, a man named Gary had set up a camping chair directly opposite them, opened a flask of coffee, and was watching them with the patient. Critical attention of a football manager, observing the opposition's warm-up. He had not spoken, he had not moved. He had simply watched for 40 minutes with an expression suggesting he'd seen better. Unit 12 had attempted to enter a tenement building to clear upper floors as per protocol. The first 3 doors knocked had not answered. The 4th door had been opened by a man named Frank who listened to their announcement, said "Naw," and closed the door. They knocked again. Frank opened the door again and said, "I said naw," and closed it again. They were considering their options. Unit 19 had lost a pulse rifle, not to enemy fire, not to a direct confrontation. A teenage boy had simply walked past, picked it up from where Soldier Garin had set it down against a wall while consulting a map, and walked off with it. By the time Garin noticed, the boy was gone. The rifle was later recovered 2 streets away, propped against a lamppost with a handwritten note attached that said, "Found this. It's probably yours." The note was signed Cheers. Draxus read that last report twice. "They returned it," he said. "Yes, Commander." With a note, why, Vex considered this carefully. "It's possible they didn't want it, Commander. It's also possible they wanted us to know they could have kept it." Draxus thought about that for a moment. It was worse. The second option was significantly worse. Meanwhile, at the Cambuslang depot, Kenny had finished his phone calls and was now coordinating something that defied easy categorization. 7 forklifts. 3 flatbed trucks. A telescopic handler borrowed from a construction site 2 miles away, whose owner had asked no questions because Kenny had explained the situation in 30 seconds, and the owner had said, "Aye, right." Take it. 2 retired mechanical engineers who had showed up because they'd heard something interesting was happening, and they had nothing better to do on a Friday night. And Bill Henderson, the structural surveyor from Partick, standing in the middle of the depot with his calculations, and a look on his face that people who knew Bill recognized as the specific expression he got when a problem was exactly the right size to be. "Interesting, the landing struts," Bill said, for the 4th time, to the group assembled around him. "It's very simple. The ships need stable ground contact to maintain power transfer to their weapon systems. Disrupt the ground contact and you disrupt the power. Look." He held up his paper. Basic load distribution. Same principle as undermining a wall footing. You don't need to break the ship. You just need to make the ground beneath it disagree with the ship. Kenny looked at the calculations. Kenny was not a structural engineer. Kenny drove a forklift. But Kenny had spent 30 years moving heavy things in tight spaces, and he understood intuitively and completely exactly what Bill was describing. So we're basically, Kenny said slowly, digging a very targeted hole. Several holes, Bill said. Precisely placed. At 1 in the morning. The ground's dry, it'll be fine. Kenny looked at the forklifts. He looked at the flatbed trucks. He looked at the telescopic handler. He looked at the 2 retired engineers who were already pulling on work gloves with the quiet enthusiasm of men who had been waiting for an interesting problem for years. Right, Kenny said. Who brought shovels? 4 hands went up. Back in the pub, Rab McAllister had not moved from his position outside the anchor. He had finished his can and opened another. Cale, the Vorkai ground team leader, was still standing opposite him. Cale was beginning to understand, at a deep and uncomfortable level, that the standard framework of conquest, appear, overwhelm, dominate, except surrender, was missing a step for this particular city. A step that nobody had thought to include because nobody had ever needed it before. The step was, what do you do when they simply don't acknowledge that they've lost? Not aggressive resistance. Not organized military counterattack, just this, a man on a pavement, a can of lager. 31 years of Friday nights that had seen worse than this and intended to see more. You understand, Cale said for the 3rd time, that we have the capability to level this entire city block. Aye, Rab said, and that does not concern you. Rab looked at him with the genuine puzzlement of a man being asked a question with an obvious answer. Look, pal, I grew up 2 streets from here. I've watched this city get knocked down and get back up more times than I can count. Buildings get built. Buildings get knocked down. People stay. He took a sip. So ye can level a city block, but then what? Cale opened his mouth. He didn't have an answer for then what. Never needed one before. His radio crackled again. The report from the Western District was coming in. And whatever Cale had been expecting, more confused soldiers, more strange civilian behavior, more untranslatable Scottish idiom. It was not what the voice on the other end was describing. Because in the Western District, the lights on 3 Vorkai landing ships had just flickered. And in the Cambuslang depot, Bill Henderson had looked at his calculations, looked at the ground, and smiled quietly to himself. The lights flickered for 6 seconds, then they came back, full power. Every weapon array, every scanner, every atmospheric processor on all 3 Western District ships hummed back to operational status. The Vorkai damage assessment took 40 seconds and returned clean. No breach, no weapon impact. No detectable attack. Draxus looked at the assessment and felt the first real threat of unease he'd experienced since leaving the home system. What caused the power fluctuation? He asked, his technical officer. A meticulous Vorkai named Sorn pulled the sensor data. He looked at it, he checked it again. He ran a secondary analysis. He turned in his chair with the expression of someone who was about to say something they would rather not say. Ground subsidence, Commander. Explain. The Earth beneath landing ships 7, 9, and 11 has shifted. Not dramatically. Approximately 40 centimeters of vertical displacement across a targeted area beneath 2 of the 3 primary landing struts on each vessel. Sorn paused. The displacement is not natural. It was engineered, Draxus stared. They dug holes under our ships. Targeted excavations, Commander, precisely placed to maximize load redistribution. Whoever designed this understood the structural requirements of the landing struts in considerable detail. They couldn't know our structural specifications. Sorn pulled up a secondary image, a visual scan of the area around the affected ships. Figures in the darkness, machinery, 1 large vehicle with a telescopic arm. A man in a jacket holding papers, pointing at the ground, directing the machinery with calm hand signals. They appear to have worked it out. Commander, Draxus looked at the figure with the papers. Who is that? Civilian, Commander. No military affiliation detected. Our analysis suggests he is some form of construction specialist. A construction specialist is destabilizing our landing ships. with what appears to be a very accurate mental model of our load. Distribution systems. Yes. Commander, there was a silence on the bridge that had a specific texture to it. The texture of an empire realizing that its margin of error was considerably smaller than advertised. Bill Henderson, for his part, was not thinking about empires. He was thinking about the third strut on Ship 9, which was sitting on a patch of ground that looked soft, but was actually underlaid with sandstone at a depth of about 60 centimeters, which changed the calculation slightly. He pulled his pencil from behind his ear and adjusted the figures. He called over Kenny's cousin Malcolm, who was operating the telescopic handler, and pointed to a spot 2 meters to the left of where Malcolm had been working. There, Bill said. You sure? Malcolm asked. Aye. Sandstone layer. You want to go around it, not through it. The displacement will be cleaner. Malcolm nodded and moved the machine. Neither of them felt particularly heroic about this. It was a structural problem. Bill liked structural problems. They had rules, and if you understood the rules well enough, the problem usually told you its own solution, inside the anchor. The situation had changed shape. Cale had pulled his ground team back 20 meters, not a retreat officially, but a tactical repositioning to reassess perimeter parameters, which was what the report would say. In practice, it meant 40 Vokai soldiers were standing in a cluster on Argyle Street, looking at the door of a pub, while Rab McAllister leaned against the wall beside it. And Davy Connor had gone inside to use the toilet and come back with a fresh round. Stuart, the barman, had brought out a standing ashtray from inside, not because anyone was smoking, but because it gave him something to lean on while he watched. Cale's translator module had been working at elevated capacity for the past 90 minutes. It had successfully processed approximately 80% of what it heard. The remaining 20% was being flagged as culturally specific linguistic patterns. Translation pending, which was a polite way of saying the system had given up on some of it, one of Cale's soldiers. A young officer named Dav, who had never been on a planetary conquest before and was not sure this was what he had signed up for, leaned close to Cale and said quietly, "Sir." "They're not scared of us." "I'm aware," Cale said. "Should we escalate?" Cale looked at the group outside the anchor, Rab, Davy, Stuart with the ashtray. Big Tam, who had come back from wherever he'd been, and was now standing at the end of the group with his arms folded, and an expression suggesting he was prepared to wait indefinitely. Behind them, through the pub windows, more faces, people who had come out of their houses, people who had walked toward the commotion instead of away from it. A crowd that was not armed, not aggressive, not threatening, just absolutely immovably present. Cale had been trained to escalate against resistance. This was not resistance. He didn't have a word for what this was. "No," he said. "We don't escalate." He didn't fully know why he said it, but some part of his 300 years of accumulated Vokai cultural inheritance was telling him, with quiet insistence, that escalating against this specific group of people, in this specific situation, would not produce the desired result. That it would produce some other result entirely. That the man with the can of lager had asked, "Then what?" And that question had not been rhetorical. The radio crackled. Another report from the Western District. The lights on Ship 11 had flickered again, longer this time. 15 seconds, and then the call came in from the ship itself. Landing Ship 11 was reporting a list. Not dramatic, not dangerous yet, but a measurable tilt in its chassis, 1.3 degrees off vertical, as the ground beneath its secondary struts continued its slow, engineered migration. Draxus gripped the edge of his command console. "Get those ships airborne," he said. "Now, Commander, mid-sequence power transfer during ground contact. I know the risk. Get them up." The engines on Ships 7, 9, and 11 screamed to life. The ground shook. Buildings across the Western District rattled. Every window in a 6-block radius vibrated in its frame. In the Cambuslang depot, Bill Henderson looked up at the lights on the horizon as 3 alien warships fired their engines simultaneously. He watched them lift. He looked at his calculations. He looked at the spot on the ground where Malcolm had been working with the telescopic handler. "HM," Bill said. Kenny looked at him. "What? That worked faster than I expected." Kenny looked at the ships rising into the night sky. We moved them," Bill said simply. They're not destroyed, just repositioned. But now they can't land in the same spots. He paused. They'll need to recalculate their ground contact points for the whole district. Another pause. Which takes time. Kenny stared at him. How much time? Bill thought about it. Depends on their survey equipment. If it's anything like ours, he did a quick mental calculation. About 4 hours, maybe 5. Kenny pulled out his phone. He had a lot of calls to make. Because if Bill Henderson and 7 forklifts and a telescopic handler had bought 4 hours, the question was what Glasgow was going to do with 4 hours. And Rab McAllister, leaning against the wall of the anchor with his can, watching 3 alien warships reposition themselves overhead with the mild interest of a man watching buses, was already thinking about exactly that. Draxus called a command meeting at 01:30. He stood at the head of the briefing room aboard the flagship and looked at his officers and tried to conduct himself with the authority appropriate to a Supreme Commander of the 7th Expansion Fleet. It was difficult. The status board behind him showed 3 ships repositioned, 1 unit tactically reorganized, 4 anomaly flags still active, and a civilian structural specialist who had been upgraded by the ship's automated threat assessment system from non-combatant to active strategic concern. He decided not to mention that last one. Out loud, status, he said. Vex delivered it with characteristic economy. Western District, ships repositioned, ground teams maintaining perimeter, no forward progress. Eastern District, units holding position, civilian presence persistent, no escalation. Northern Sector, drone network reporting cooperative interference. Translator drones GX-4, GX-7, and GX-12 had been decorated, redirected. And in one case briefly adopted by a man named Gordon who had walked it home and offered it tea before being contacted by the drone recovery team. Gordon offered the drone tea, Draxus repeated. Yes. Commander, and the drone accepted. Vex paused. The drone's behavioral adaptation protocols engaged, Commander. It has been flagged for psychological recalibration. Draxus moved on. What is their military response? There isn't one, Commander. No formal military assets have engaged us. No aircraft, no armored vehicles, no organized defense. Then what is this? Vex looked at his notes. This appears to be the civilian population, Commander. Doing what? Vex paused again, longer this time. Being present, Commander. Persistently, creatively, and in a manner that our operational models do not have a category for. Draxus looked at the status board. He thought about 43 conquered worlds. He thought about the clean, repeatable pattern that conquest followed: shock, confusion, fear, compliance. He thought about the 11 months of research. He thought about the 12 analysts and their 15,000-page report. He thought about the man with the can of lager who had asked, "Then what?" and been completely genuinely curious about the answer. Options, he said. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Kale, who had come aboard for the briefing, said, "Commander, I have a recommendation." Everyone looked at him, talked to them. Another silence, different texture. "He been standing on Argyle Street for 2 hours, Kale said. The man outside the pub, Rab McAllister, the civilian, he's not hostile. He's not afraid. He's not trying to defeat us. He's just," Kale searched for the word, "present. He's simply there, and he has no intention of being anywhere else, and he wants to know what we want and why, and he hasn't received a satisfactory answer." A pause. "Commander." "Neither have I, honestly." The room was very quiet. Draxus looked at his second in command. "Vex." "It's unconventional, Commander," Vex said carefully. "But our conventional options are producing unconventional results." Draxus looked at the status board for a long time. 3 ships repositioned. 1 drone psychologically compromised. 1 structural surveyor classified as strategic threat. A football scarf on the sensor array of GX-7 that nobody had been able to successfully remove. "Set up a communication channel," he said. "Ground level, Argyle Street. Shall I prepare a formal delegation, Commander?" Draxus thought about it. "No," he said, "just me and Vex and a translator." Another pause. "And someone find out what attendance is." At 02:15, Supreme Commander Draxus of the Volkai 7th Expansion Fleet descended from his command ship in a personal transport, landed in the middle of Argyle Street, and walked toward the anchor pub. The crowd that had assembled watched him come. Nobody ran, nobody cheered. A few people had their phones out. Rab McAllister was still on his spot. He had switched to tea about an hour ago, because it was getting late and he had a knee that gave him trouble in the cold, and he wasn't 30 anymore. He watched the very large gray alien commander walk across the street toward him and felt, more than anything else, a sense of mild vindication. Draxus stopped 3 meters away, his translator activated. "I am Supreme Commander Draxus," he said, "of the Vorkai 7th Expansion Fleet." "Rab," said Rab, a pause. Rab McAllister, retired electrician. "That's Stewart behind the bar, Davies the one with the earplugs." "Big Tam," he gestured to the large man at the end of the group. "Big Tam doesn't really need an introduction." Draxus looked at Big Tam. Big Tam nodded once. Draxus looked back at Rab. "Your planet," he said slowly, "is not responding as expected." "To what?" "To the invasion." Rab considered this. "Well," he said, "what were ye expecting?" Draxus, for the first time in 300 years of military command, said honestly, "Fear." Rab nodded slowly. The way a man nods when something makes sense, even if the something is slightly sad. "Aye," he said, "that's your first problem right there." He gestured toward the pub door. "You want a cup of tea?" "Stewart does a decent cup." Draxus looked at the door. He looked at Vex. Vex gave the microscopic shrug of a man who had stopped being surprised 90 minutes ago. "Yes," Draxus said. Inside the Anchor, Supreme Commander Draxus sat at a pub table, wrapped both lower arms around a mug of tea that Stewart had made strong enough to resurface a road, and had what was later described in the Vorkai Historical Archive as the most consequential conversation in interplanetary relations, which mostly involved Rab explaining why Glasgow had already been through enough that another thing trying to knock it down was. Honestly, a bit of a cheek. Draxus listened. He was a good listener, which was somewhat surprising for an emperor. But 300 years left room for unexpected qualities. He asked 3 questions. The first was why the people hadn't left. Rab said, "Because it's ours." The second was why they weren't afraid. Rab said, "Because being afraid of it doesn't change it." The third was what they wanted. Rab looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "For you to take your ships and go, pal. And maybe next time don't park over someone's city without asking." Draxus sat with that for a while. Outside, across the city, 4 hours had almost passed. Bill Henderson was on his second thermos of coffee. Kenny had made 43 phone calls. The retired engineers had gone home satisfied, their specific problem elegantly resolved. The teenage boy who had picked up the pulse rifle and left a note had gone to bed. And his note had been framed by the Vorkai recovery team and placed in the evidence archive, where it would remain for the next 200 years as a classified document. Because the cultural analysis team couldn't agree on what it meant, and nobody wanted to file it incorrectly. The football match score had been 2-1. Davy Connor had not missed a single minute of it. The Vorkai ships left Glasgow at 04:47 in the morning. Not a retreat. Draxus was very specific about the terminology in his official report, and tactical withdrawal following strategic reassessment was the phrase he used. And he used it 4 times to make sure it was clear. The ships rose from the city in the gray pre-dawn, their running lights amber against the clouds, and climbed steadily until they were just lights among lights, and then nothing at all. Argyle Street was quiet. Rab McAllister stood outside the Anchor and watched them go. Davy Connor came out and stood beside him, hands in his jacket pockets against the chill. Big Tam was there too, and Stewart, who had locked up properly and turned the sign to closed, though the lights were still on inside. A handful of others from the neighborhood who had spent the night in various states of stubborn, patient presence. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Big Tam said, "Right. Who's for a chip?" Everyone was for a chip. The debrief that Supreme Commander Draxus filed with the Vorkai High Council was 12 pages long. It was honest, which made it unusual. It described the technology failures, the ground displacement tactic, the drone interference, the landing ship repositioning, in accurate technical detail. It described the civilian response in equally accurate but considerably more difficult to categorize terms. It concluded with a recommendation that was unprecedented in Vorkai military history. Do not attempt conquest of Earth. Not because of the military capability, the High Council had expected that objection. Earth's conventional military capacity, while formidable, was not beyond the Volkai's ability to overcome. The recommendation was on different grounds entirely. The document read, "This civilization does not respond to the standard conquest framework, because the standard conquest framework relies on the target population experiencing a gap between their current situation and the threatened situation, and wanting to close that gap by complying. This population does not appear to perceive a gap. They consider their current situation, regardless of its objective comfort level, to be theirs. They will defend it not because they are unaware of the threat, but because they are completely aware of it, have decided the threat is insufficient reason to change their behavior. And will sit on a pavement in the dark drinking tea until you figure that out." Draxus added a personal note at the bottom, which was not standard protocol. It said, "I asked one of them what they wanted. He said he wanted us to leave and to ask next time before parking our ships over someone's city. I think we should take that seriously." The High Council read the report 3 times. They voted on the recommendation. It passed. Bill Henderson heard about the departure on the radio at 5 a.m., made himself another cup of tea, and went to bed. He had a consultation booked for Monday morning, a cracked retaining wall in Motherwell, and he wanted to be rested. He did not consider himself a hero. He had seen a structural problem and applied structural thinking to it. That was all. Kenny drove to work that morning and told nobody what had happened. Not because he'd been told not to, but because he wasn't sure how to explain it in a way that didn't sound completely mental. He settled on telling his wife that something interesting had happened, and she had nodded in the way of a woman who had learned not to ask follow-up questions about Kenny's Friday nights. Cale filed a separate report, shorter than Draxus's, more personal. It described the moment he had taken one step back on Gallowgate Street when Big Tam kept walking. It described the feeling he'd had, not fear, not tactical calculation, something more like recognition. The recognition that the man walking toward him had already decided how the night was going to go and was simply proceeding accordingly. Cale wrote, "I have been trained to identify strength. I am not sure I have ever encountered it in this particular form before. It does not announce itself. It does not threaten. It simply continues and expects you to understand why and is mildly annoyed when you don't." He recommended the report be added to training materials. It was. Drone GX-7 was eventually recovered and sent for recalibration. The football scarf was removed. The scarf was cataloged, analyzed, and placed in the same archive as the note from the teenage boy. The cultural analysis team filed a single combined report on both items that concluded. These humans appear to communicate primarily through casual gestures that carry disproportionate strategic implications. Further study required. Further study was never authorized. The analysts assigned to it all independently requested reassignment after 2 weeks, citing elevated stress levels. The last image in Draxus's personal log from that night was a visual scan he'd taken from the transport as it lifted from Argyle Street. Below, the Anchor pub, lights on, door closed. The street quiet, and in front of it, one man, standing on the pavement in the early morning chill. Watching the ships go with the expression of someone who has watched a lot of things come and go, and intends to be here when the next thing comes. Rab McAllister went home at 5:15. He made himself a roll and square sausage, ate it standing at the kitchen counter, and went to bed. His alarm was set for 9. He had a thing to do on Saturday morning, and he was going to do it. Some things, alien invasion or not, didn't change. Across the galaxy, in a Volkai military training room some years later, a young officer sat through a lecture on Earth that included one case study, one image, and one line that every recruit in the Empire eventually learned by heart. The image was a visual scan of a man on a pavement outside a pub at 2 in the morning, watching a fleet of warships with mild, patient, unamused eyes. The line was, "They are not difficult to conquer because they are powerful. They are difficult to conquer because they have already decided they belong where they are. Plan accordingly." Or better yet, don't plan. The young officer looked at the image for a long time. Then he put his hand up and asked, "What's a tenance?" The instructor smiled. "That," he said, "is classified. If you made it this far, you're one of us now. Drop a comment telling me what you would have done when that drone floated into the anchor. Share this with someone who needs a good story today. Subscribe if you want more, because there are a lot more corners of this universe where humans are absolutely refusing to cooperate. See you in the next one.